There's a city on every old map that no one can find today. It stretches across entire continents. It has towers, roads, and a name. That name is Tartaria, and the story of how it disappeared is either the greatest natural collapse in human history or the most successful erasure of a civilization ever attempted. One of those two things is true, and the evidence for both is sitting in plain sight, in libraries, in museums, and carved into the walls of buildings that nobody can explain. Let us start with the maps. In 1670, a cartographer named Joan Bleu produced one of the most detailed world maps of his era. It was called the Nova Totius Terrarum Orbis Tabula. On that map, covering the land between the Caspian Sea and the Pacific Ocean, is a single political entity labeled Tartaria. It is enormous. It dwarfs the Ottoman Empire. It rivals the size of all of Europe combined. And it is not alone. Dozens of other European cartographers across 2 centuries marked the same territory. Abraham Ortelius in 1570, Gerardus Mercator in 1569, Guillaume de Lille in 1723. They all agree. There's a place called Tartaria. It has a capital. It has internal divisions. It has trade routes. Then by 1850, it is simply gone. Not conquered, not renamed, gone. If you found this interesting, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell right now, because what comes next is the part they never taught you in school. The conventional explanation is that Tartaria was never a single empire, that European mapmakers were using the word as a vague ethnic label for Mongol and Turkic peoples across Central Asia, that it was cartographic shorthand, not political fact. That is the official position, and it has one serious problem. The maps do not support it. Many of these maps show Tartaria with distinct borders, with named cities inside it, with a capital city called Siberia marked in western Siberia, not the entire region. They show subdivisions like Muscovite Tartary, Chinese Tartary, and independent Tartary. You do not draw borders around a vague ethnic category. You do not name capitals inside a label. These are features of a recognized political entity. And European mapmakers of the 16 and 1700s were meticulous professionals. Men like Nicholas Sanson, who produced his map of Tartaria in 1679, were royal geographers. They were not guessing. So what was Tartaria actually? Here is what the primary sources say. In 1559, the English traveler Anthony Jenkinson left Moscow on a mission for the Muscovy Company. He traveled south through what is now Kazakhstan and into Uzbekistan. He kept a detailed journal. In it, he describes organized towns, functioning markets, and a population that did not match the image of scattered nomads. He describes passing through a place called Mangoshlak and meeting with a ruler called Timur Sultan. This is not a wandering tribe. This is an administered territory. In 1636, a Russian diplomat named Fyodor Bykov made the journey east toward China. His route took him through territories that are labeled on contemporary maps as Tartaria. He reported settlements, political structures, and taxation systems. These are not the descriptions of an empty steppe. Then there is the architectural problem. Across Siberia, the Urals, and Central Asia, there are buildings that do not fit the official timeline. In Tobolsk, a city in western Siberia founded by the Russians in 1587, there is a Kremlin built in the early 1700s. It is stunning. It has white stone walls, Baroque towers, and a cathedral. The official story is that Russian builders constructed it. But local historians have noted for decades that the foundations of structures in Tobolsk and surrounding areas show evidence of much older construction beneath them. Not older by decades, older by centuries. The stones cut in ways that Russian colonial architecture does not account for. The second camp goes further, much further. They argue that Tartaria was not just a political empire. They argue it was a technologically advanced civilization that was deliberately destroyed, and that the evidence of that destruction is visible today in what they call the mud flood theory. The mud flood idea holds that sometime in the late 1700s or early 1800s, a catastrophic event, possibly a global reset or targeted attack, buried entire cities in mud and sediment. The evidence they point to is architectural. Across Europe, North America, and Central Asia, there are buildings where the ground floor windows sit at ground level or below it. The argument is that these buildings were originally much taller, that a layer of mud buried the lower floors, and that the official explanation of natural sediment buildup over centuries does not account for the uniformity of this phenomenon across continents. In St. Petersburg, founded by Peter the Great in 1703, there are buildings in the historic center where basement windows align awkwardly with the street. In Philadelphia, built from the 1680s onward, similar anomalies exist. In dozens of cities in Central Asia and Siberia, the same pattern. Proponents of the mud flood theory point to orphan trains in America in the mid-1800s, when thousands of children with no identified parents were shipped from eastern cities to western farms. They argue these children were not the product of poverty and immigration, as the official record states. They argue they were orphaned by a catastrophe. The orphan train program ran from 1854 to 1929 and relocated approximately 250,000 children. That is a real number. The program was real. The interpretation of it as evidence of a hidden disaster is the controversial part. This is the moment in the video where, if you have not already, you should subscribe and leave a comment telling me what you think they are hiding, because the next section is where this gets genuinely uncomfortable. Back to the architecture, because the architectural argument is the strongest one regardless of which camp you're in. In 1851, an exhibition hall called the Crystal Palace was built in Hyde Park, London, in just 9 months. It was made of cast iron and plate glass. It was 982 feet long. It was the largest glass building in the world at that point. The speed and precision of its construction has been cited by Tartaria researchers as evidence of a pre-existing technological infrastructure. The argument is that Victorian builders could not have achieved this from scratch, that they were using inherited technology and inherited materials from a prior civilization. This is speculative, but the underlying question is not insane. How did construction standards in the 1800s so dramatically exceed what came before them? The Industrial Revolution is the mainstream answer. The Tartaria theorists say the Industrial Revolution was a relearning, not an invention. The same argument gets applied to world fairs. The 1893 World Columbian Exposition in Chicago covered 690 acres and featured 200 buildings constructed in under 2 years. The chief architect was Daniel Burnham. The buildings were in a neoclassical style so refined and so consistent that the fairground was called the White City. After the fair ended, almost all of it was demolished. Why build something that extraordinary and then tear it all down? The official reason is that the buildings were temporary, constructed from a material called staff, a mixture of plaster, cement, and jute fiber. But photographs of the construction show foundations and structural elements that look far more permanent. The demolition of the White City in 1894 and 1895 is, to Tartaria theorists, evidence of an active campaign to remove visible remnants of prior architecture. There is a man named Nikolai Levashov, a Russian researcher who died in 2012, who wrote extensively about what he called the falsification of Russian history. He argued that the Romanov dynasty, with the backing of Western European powers, systematically destroyed evidence of a pre-Romanov Slavic and Tartarian civilization. His work is dismissed by mainstream historians, but has gained a large following in Russia and the former Soviet states. Levashov pointed specifically to the destruction of the Alexandrian libraries of the Slavic world, the burning of manuscripts in the 1700s and 1800s, and the replacement of a native Russian chronological system with the Julian and then Gregorian calendars. He claimed that the year 1700, the year Peter the Great reset the Russian calendar from the Byzantine year of 7208 to the Western European standard, was not just a bureaucratic change, it was an erasure of 7,200 years of recorded history. Is that true? It is not verifiable. But the calendar change is real. Peter did make it. In January of 1700, he issued a decree that Russia would join European nations in using the Julian calendar and counting years from the birth of Christ. Before that, Russia counted years from the creation of the world in the Byzantine tradition. The reset happened. What it erased is the question. Now we go to the genetics and the linguistics, because this is where the establishment record gets genuinely strange. The word Tartar or Tatar does not have a clean etymology. It first appears in Chinese records around the 9th century, referring to groups north of the Gobi Desert. It appears in Persian records in the 13th century. It appears in European records in the 13th century during the Mongol invasions. Medieval European writers connected it to Tartarus, the Greek underworld, because the Mongol armies seemed to come from below the edge of the known world. But the people labeled as Tartars across these centuries are not one people. They are dozens of different ethnic groups. Mongols, Turks, Kazakhs, Siberian peoples, Crimean peoples. The label was applied to all of them. Why would European cartographers lump such diversity under one political name unless there was a political reality that actually connected them? The Crimean Khanate, a genuine political state, existed from 1441 to 1783. It was a successor state to the Golden Horde. It had a capital at Bakhchisarai, which still stands in present-day Crimea in Ukraine. It had an organized government, a standing army, and diplomatic relations with the Ottoman Empire and Poland. It was conquered by Catherine the Great of Russia in 1783. That conquest is documented. What is less discussed is what happened immediately after. Catherine oversaw the systematic destruction of Crimean Tatar cultural records. Libraries were burned, mosques were converted. The Tatar language was suppressed in official life. This is not theory. This is recorded in the same European diplomatic dispatches that praised Catherine as an enlightened ruler. The pattern repeats in Kazan, conquered by Ivan the Terrible in 1552. In Astrakhan, taken in 1556. In Siberia, where the Khanate of Sibir fell to Russian forces under Yermak Timofeyevich in 1582. Each conquest was followed by the same sequence: destruction of records, replacement of local administrators, renaming of places. The Khanate of Sibir, which gave Siberia its name, was a functioning state with a capital at Iskar, near present-day Tobolsk. After 1582, Iskar was abandoned and Tobolsk was built nearby. The ruins of Iskar still exist. They have never been fully excavated. The Russian government has not prioritized the site. Here is what makes the Tartaria question more than a fringe internet theory. In 2012, a team of Kazakhstani archaeologists working at a site called Borsnir in the Kostanay region discovered the remains of a settlement dating to approximately the 12th century. It showed evidence of organized urban planning, a drainage system, and metallurgical workshops. It did not match the nomadic culture that mainstream history assigns to that region in that period. The lead archaeologist, Ibar Kasanalin, published his findings in the Journal of Central Eurasian Studies. The findings were acknowledged, briefly discussed in academic circles, and then largely ignored in popular historical narratives. The site has not been fully funded for excavation. In 2017, a separate team working near Arkeum in the Chelyabinsk Oblast of Russia announced new dating results for the Sintashta culture site there. Arkeum is a circular fortified settlement. It is real. It dates to approximately 2100 BCE. It is one of the oldest known urban complexes in Asia. It was discovered in 1987 when a reservoir was being planned nearby. Soviet archaeologists campaigned successfully to protect it. The site overturns the standard narrative of the Eurasian steppe as a primitive backwater. Arkeum shows planned urban construction 4,000 years ago in a region that mainstream history treats as having been populated by nomads until the medieval period. None of this proves Tartaria in the conspiratorial sense, but it proves that the history of Central Asia and Siberia is vastly more complex than what gets taught. The official story of that region, as a cold and empty steppe occasionally crossed by horse nomads, is demonstrably incomplete. The question is whether it is accidentally incomplete or deliberately so. The strongest argument for deliberate incompleteness comes from a man named Anatoly Fomenko. He is a professor of mathematics at Moscow State University. He is also the creator of New Chronology, a theory first published in 1994. Fomenko argues, using statistical analysis of ancient texts, that recorded history is dramatically shorter than we think, that events assigned to ancient Greece and Rome actually occurred in the medieval period, that historical timelines were deliberately stretched by scholars working for political patrons who needed ancient legitimacy for young dynasties. His work is not accepted by mainstream historians. It is considered pseudoscience, but Fomenko is not a crank. He is a credentialed mathematician. His statistical methodology has been reviewed and critiqued by serious scholars. The critique is that his method is flawed, not that the underlying question is illegitimate. What Fomenko and the Tartaria theorists share is a suspicion of the archive. The archive that tells us what happened in Central Asia in the 1700s is largely Russian imperial, produced by or under the oversight of a government that had direct political interest in portraying its eastern expansion as the civilizing of wilderness. That is not a fringe concern. That is a basic historiographical problem that professional historians of Russia acknowledge. Orlando Figes, one of the most respected Western historians of Russia, wrote in his 2002 book, Natasha's Dance, that Russian imperial culture systematically suppressed non-Russian identities within the empire. He was writing about the 19th century, but the dynamic he describes began earlier. The last piece of evidence sits in language. The English word tartar survives today primarily as the name of a dental substance. Tartar sauce, steak tartare. These are echoes of a name that was once on every map. The word was common enough in English to pass into food culture and then lose its geographical meaning entirely. That is how thoroughly a name can be stripped of its original context, not through erasure, but through dilution. In 1763, a Scottish schoolteacher named James Macpherson published what he claimed were translations of ancient Gaelic poems by a 3rd century bard named Ossian. The poems were celebrated across Europe. Napoleon carried them into battle. Goethe quoted them. Then scholars discovered that Macpherson had largely fabricated them. The Ossian affair became the defining example of historical forgery in European culture. What it proved is that fabrication at scale is possible, that it can fool the most educated people for decades, and that when the forgery is finally exposed, the cultural appetite for the original story does not disappear. People still wanted Ossian to be real. They just wanted it to be true. That is exactly where the Tartaria conversation sits today. The appetite for it is enormous. Videos about Tartaria on YouTube collectively have hundreds of millions of views. In 2021, a single video on the channel Universe Inside You about Tartaria received over 12 million views in its first month. The comment sections of these videos are filled with people from Russia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Ukraine saying that the story matches what their grandparents told them. Oral histories that were never written down because writing them down was dangerous. The Crimean Tatars were deported by Stalin in May of 1944. All of them. 190,000 people removed from their homeland in 48 hours. 46% of them died in the first 2 years of exile, according to Soviet internal documents declassified after 1991. The crime was so total and so fast that within a decade, there were Crimean children who had never seen Crimea and grandparents who could not speak the language to children who had grown up in Uzbekistan. That is not ancient history. That is within living memory. The last map to label Tartaria as a functioning political territory was produced by John Carey, a British cartographer, in 1806. After that, the name disappears from serious cartography. 100 years before that map, it was on every globe in every educated home in Europe. The speed of that disappearance from the cartographic record is not matched by any natural process of political change. Nations take centuries to lose their names. Tartaria's lost its in 2 generations. The buildings are still there. The foundations are still there. The bones of the people who built them are still in the ground, unexcavated, unfunded, and unnamed. And somewhere in a Russian state archive, there are documents that have been classified since the Soviet era that have never been released, relating specifically to the pre-Romanov history of Siberia. In 2019, a Russian investigative journalist named Irina Slavina filed a request under Russian Freedom of Information law for access to those archives. She was denied. In 2020, her apartment was raided by Russian Federal Security Service officers. In October of 2020, she set herself on fire outside the FSB building in Nizhny Novgorod and left a note that read, "Please blame the Russian Federation for my death." She was not investigating Tartaria. She was investigating corruption. But the archive she could not open is the same archive. The past and the present in Russia are locked behind the same door.